Come set your rule and reign in our hearts again. Increase in us, we pray.
Hey, Trinity Grace. Welcome to New Community. We are now in our season of Advent, where we are celebrating Jesus' first Advent, or first coming, even as we long for his second and final Advent, his return. You can see in the Chung home that we are observing Christmas, and under the tree here there are already some presents, and we're waiting patiently to open them on Christmas Day. And I was thinking about it, and Christmas presents very much can be a beautiful metaphor for God's gift to us in Christ. These presents themselves, that are under the tree right now, are from some relatives from far away, and they were mailed to us. And all the more, it's the sense of this precious gift sent from loved ones from far away, and that's kind of analogous. That's akin to God sending us many gifts from heaven. And I'm not only speaking of Jesus Christ, but God giving us his word through the law and the prophets. And we're waiting to see how that gift unfolds. We're waiting to see how that gift is unpackaged. And how appropriate then that on Christmas Day that we open these concrete, tangible, literal presents. And they are a wonderful symbol of how on Christmas Day God reveals how the gift of his word and his prophecies, his promises through his servants and prophets and the law, that it all culminates to being unwrapped, figuratively speaking, to reveal Jesus Christ. And literally speaking, that God wraps himself, the second person of himself, in flesh, in babe form, to be found human, and for Jesus to live the life that we live, and to become the sinless, perfect sacrifice for the sins of the world. So I hope that you have a sense of joy and encouragement, anticipation, as we with all the more focus observe Advent and think upon and meditate upon Christ's first coming, and all as we even long for his second return, or his second coming, his return. That's a good segue into this week's passage and this week's study. Did my best to unpack the genealogy of Jesus according to Matthew, and it was fun, at least for me, to unpack that. And before we get into it, we do have a question of the week, but it's not so much a question in response to a previous week's study, like questions of the week of the past, but it's a question in preparation for today's study. And here's the question. Why do Matthew and Luke have two different genealogies? This is true. They have two different genealogies. And on the surface, in fact, people who are not friends of Christianity and want to be skeptical of Christianity point to these two genealogies to discourage Christians and to raise cause for doubt and unbelief. But I want to reassure you, even before I get to answering the question, that these two genealogies are very much reasonable and have clear explanations, and in fact they bring all the more just facets to the beauty of God's gospel through his son Jesus Christ, and it gives us more insight, and just all the more makes God's love for us and his plan for us, his plan and history of redemption, more fully orbed. So let's answer the question, why do Matthew and Luke have two different genealogies? Let me first begin by explaining what's similar. They both recount generations between Abraham and David. And between Abraham and David, Luke and Matthew are pretty much identical, save two names. I believe it's two names, but pretty much identical, and those two names can be explained. I won't get into it, but they can be explained. Now, what is all the more easily explained is that Luke goes beyond Abraham into the past and follows the genealogy all the way back to Adam, meaning the first human being, the one that God created, and Luke refers to him even as Adam, the Son of God. Now, of course, Luke does not mean that Adam was part of the Trinity, that Adam was divine and a deity, but certainly Adam was the first human child of God because God created him. Now, where Matthew and Luke truly differentiate, and I'm certain that, I'm just obviously making my best conclusion, but Matthew would not disagree with the fact that Abraham is a descendant ultimately of Adam. Now, where Matthew and Luke look very different in their genealogies then is from King David forward, leading up to Joseph, the legal father of Jesus, not the human flesh and blood father. And so those names are completely different. Matthew has Solomon as David's son, and Luke records Nathan as David's son. Now, they were both David's sons, but the difference is that they're two different genealogical lines. Both of them legit, both of them historical, but which one is right? That's the question. And I'd like to say that both are right. To summarize, basically, Joseph had two fathers. He had one biological father, and he had one adoptive father. Now, the way that can be possible is that Mary, at the time that she was married to Joseph, she had no brothers to carry on her family's name. At the time, it was a very patriarchal society, and therefore the name of the family being carried on through through sons was a very important aspect of cultural life. Actually, Koreans can relate. Koreans are very much still about that. But anyway, I digress. Thankfully, I have Christopher. Just kidding. I digress. My identity is in Christ. And so what would typically happen in the culture is that the father with no sons, whose daughter is getting married, he would adopt the son, his future son-in-law, to become his son and to carry on his name legally. So just to repeat and summarize, it's possible and it's very reasonable that there are two genealogies because we don't know whether Matthew or Luke is recording the biological genealogy, and we don't know if Heli or Jacob, the two fathers that are recorded, which one is biological and which one is legal. But certainly it is very reasonable to read the text with the understanding that one is a legal adoptive genealogy, and that the other is a biological genealogy. Now, why would there be two different genealogies then? Why? I think it comes down to the emphasis of Matthew's gospel versus Luke's gospel. Matthew, certainly his emphasis is to convince his fellow Israelites that Jesus is the Messiah, specifically the Jewish Messiah, and that Israel's role in the world truly is meant to be a light to the Gentiles. And the Messiah would be the one to lead the nation forward in fulfilling that to its truest conclusion. Luke's emphasis, as he's writing to a Gentile, to a non-Jew, his emphasis is much broader. And that's why I think as well, Luke goes all the way back to Adam, who is the first father of all of humanity, and to emphasize Jesus' mission as opposed to the specific different emphasis of Messiah. So Matthew is emphasizing Jesus as Messiah, and therefore Jesus and his legal genealogy being linked to King David and Solomon is very important. And Luke is emphasizing all the more Jesus' mission to redeem Adam and to redeem humanity as a whole, at large. So I hope that helps. So that brings us to Matthew's genealogy and this week's study. And I want to just give some framework and to help you get started and get the ball rolling today. I just want to quickly summarize my outline from this past Sunday's sermon, and hopefully that will give you a good framework to sink some teeth into this genealogy. So I want to begin with the question, as I did on Sunday. What's your day-to-day narrative? What's the day-to-day story that gives you meaning and purpose? And what's your role in that story? Think about that. Excuse me. And that gives us context for considering God's story. Does my story line up with God's story? Specifically, first, what is God's intended story through Abraham and David? Matthew focuses very much on Abraham and David, and that Jesus is a fulfillment of Abraham and David and the story that God was meaning to write or has been writing through history. And then, how does the genealogy mirror our story? There are some curious names in the genealogy, and this is where I call on one another there in your circle to just bust out your biblical knowledge, and if you know the significance of certain names that stand out, like the women's names in there and just other characters that definitely have some blemished stories, draw all that out because it's there on purpose. The genealogy is there, especially in Matthew's gospel, to mirror our story in some sense, to show us that we are in as much need of a Messiah as the people in the genealogy. And then finally, as the genealogy climaxes with the birth of Jesus in verse 16, we need to ask, how does the Christmas story, that Jesus is born, that Jesus is God incarnate, that Jesus has condescended and come down to earth and in humiliation and finding himself in human form, how does that bring God's story to a climax? Okay? Put differently, how is Jesus truly the fulfillment of God's story that he began writing through Abraham, and God's story as he was writing it through King David and what he promised to King David? Okay? I hope that's enough to get you going. Before I hand it over to your facilitator, if I could just ask that part of your prayer at the end could be to pray for the gingerbread party that is this Saturday. We're expecting around 70 or so children, the majority of which are from our outside the church and a lot from our immediate neighborhood. If you could pray for that to be, just that the Spirit of God would continue to plant seeds of the gospel and water seeds that have already been planted. There will be a lot of returning families and children. And if you could also pray for the ESL Carol Sing that's coming up, and the Met Christmas banquet, that the Spirit of God would just bless these outreaches and just continue to make Jesus real in so many hearts. The whole point of the genealogy is that Jesus can now become part of our lineage, our history, as we become his children by faith. Okay? So God bless you. Have a great study. Bye.
Build your kingdom.